The goals of this presentation are to review ENCO's organizational mission, goals, and responsibilities as an educational accreditor, review the goals and outcomes associated with an ENCOP accredited residency program, define the key stakeholders associated with an ENCOP accredited residency, review the roles and responsibilities held by the resident and the director/mentor, discuss the resources available to residents as well as directors and mentors, and also create a forum for discussion. During this session, feel free to submit questions using the questions bar within the Air Meet platform. At the end of the day, the questions I have on the right-hand side, this blue set of questions, if you will, are some of the more common inquiries I receive as an ENCOP staff member, as well as a prosthetist orthotist. Let's jump in. ENCOP's mission and goals. ENCOP's mission is improving lives and strengthening the profession through education. We achieve this via our four main goals: to strengthen education and clinical experiences, optimize the collection, use, and dissemination of data for the benefit of the profession, demonstrate value of ENCOP services and role, and attract a more racially and ethnically diverse cohort of students to choose O&P as a career so that the future workforce better reflects the population that it serves. This session that you're attending now is actually one of the ways that ENCOP does attempt to demonstrate value of our services as well as role. Although we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about the data and the way that we focus on strengthening education and experiences as well. Now let's discuss the development of an O&P practitioner. The development of an O&P professional requires the collaboration of a CAHAP accredited O&P school and residency programs to enable comprehensive education. The lessons learned in an academic setting are complemented by real-world applications during residency, with the ultimate goal of that individual becoming an independent, competent, entry-level practitioner within the profession of orthotics and prosthetics. Now, we have residency stakeholders, and there's really four key groups of stakeholders. First and foremost is the patient. This is intentional. Remember that providing appropriate patient care is the ultimate goal of a residency. On that note, you can't have a residency without the resident. And the resident, well, they're a dynamic individual, part learner, part employee, multitasker, and truly the future of the orthotic and prosthetic profession. We have the faculty. And when I use the term faculty, a lot of individuals think, I remember my professor from O&P school, but faculty within a residency includes the directors, the mentors, but also the patient care team members that are also present. The person in the front office who may be doing some of your billing to Medicare. They might not have the letter CPO after their name, but they can teach a resident an awful lot. The same with your technician with 20 years of experience. And last, and actually intentionally least, is ENCOP. ENCOP's role is the accreditor, and we ultimately define the standards to ensure graduates of school and residency are competent in nature. And all things being equal, over the course of a 1 year or an 18-month residency, of all the stakeholders the resident and the faculty are going to interface with, ENCOP's going to be the individuals you interface the least with. On that note, there's a time and a place to reach out to us, though, and I want to talk about that. First and foremost, within our audience, I have an awful lot of current residents as well as future residents. And if there's one staff member you're going to get to know a little bit, it's going to be Mr. Eric Waters. He's a residency program assistant, and he's responsible for processing resident registration forms, maintaining your permanent records of resident education, reviewing the documentation and forms submitted using ENCOP Tracker, our tool that's used to document progress throughout the residency. He's also the person that issues certificates of completion once he audits all the records, and he even creates that ENCOP Tracker account for those residents once they are ready to start. To get a hold of him, his email address is listed right here. Now, for those of you that might be residency mentors or directors, or even considering becoming a mentor or director, if there's one ENCOP staff member you're going to interface with, it's probably Ms. Claire Doyle. Ms. Claire Doyle has the title of Residency Program Assistant, and her responsibilities include reviewing residency program applications to confirm that they are compliant with all of our standards, monitoring accreditation cycles to ensure that residency sites hosting residents maintain an active status and are in good standing with ENCOP. She also verifies that residency programs directors and mentors meet the minimum requirements to serve as an educator of residents. And she's also there to update ENCOP Tracker to ensure that the residents are correctly joined to the proper director or mentor. And she processes change requests because residents sometimes rotate to a different mentor or a different director. Her email address is listed right in the top right-hand corner. On that note, you're probably starting to realize it's usually our first initial and last name at encop.org is the best way to get a hold of us. On that note, that's the first half of our residency staff, our residency core. And what's cool about the individuals I just introduced, Mr. Waters and Ms. Doyle, for the first time ever, we actually have a residency staff that is of the same generation as our residents. So they can certainly relate. Now we do have two other staff members. Ms. Robin C. Seabrook is our executive director. And in terms of residency, she's somebody to reach out to if you're a resident and you need to verify payment of resident fees. She's the individual that maintains the books and financial records for ENCOP. And also, if you're a director or mentor and you have financial questions regarding payables or receivables with residency program fees or resident fees, or you need or want additional information about ENCOP's roles and responsibilities on a more global scale, or you want to interface with ENCOP's board of directors, Robin's a great person to reach out to. In all honesty, she provides oversight for all operations, from governance to primary education, the schools, to residency, and more. And last is myself. My name's Chris Robinson, and I mentioned that I'm the Clinical Resource Director. And ultimately, one of my main responsibilities is project management and development of ENCOP's core initiatives and programs. I also provide a fair amount of training to residents and residency directors and mentors, and guide folks on tools and resources. Actually, during this talk, I'm going to do just that. You also remember, during our goals, we discussed the importance of leveraging data and disseminating it. That's a big part of my job, as well as also fostering collaboration between our sister organizations, including CAHEP, the Academy, AOPA, ABC, and BOC, to name a few. My email address is crobinson@encop.org. And in general, if you need to get a hold of me and you're a resident, it should be related specifically to needing a clinical educator's perspective regarding some aspect of residency training. Getting signed up for a residency, Mr. Waters is probably going to be a lot more useful. Now, if you're a residency director, mentor, administrator, and you require any assistance with advertising your residency programs via OP ResCast, do come directly to me. I would be honored to get your program set up appropriately so that you can get the largest possible applicant pool and bring your program into compliance with the ENCOP requirements. Now, if you're a director or mentor and you just need a clinical perspective as well, certainly a clinical educator's perspective, I'm happy to offer. Now, with regard to getting a hold of the ENCOP staff, we have email, a phone, and even a contact form that you could use to reach out to us. Now, if you're thinking, I don't remember what all those staff members do, is there just one place I could email and they'll figure out who needs to answer? Yes, just send an email to residency@encop.org. If you're a residency mentor, director, an aspiring residency mentor director, or a future resident or a current resident, that's a great place to start. You're also welcome to give us a call at our main phone line, 703-836-7114. And our system is designed that you can actually dial through and get a hold of ENCOP. There's a series of buttons you could hit. Or if you're looking for our direct extensions, we actually list them on the ENCOP staff page. So feel free to reach out to us at our direct extension if you know I need to get a hold of Chris, for example. And last but not least is our contact form. So if you ever need to mail us something and you're thinking, what's your mailing address in Alexandria? It's on there. Plus the form's designed to help guide you to the correct staff member. So it'll ask you, are you a resident? Yes. Do you have a question about submitting your forms? Yes. And I'll make sure that that inquiry is submitted to the best staff member possible. Now, in terms of residency is shaped by the ENCOP O&P Residency Standards. Keep in mind that standards in education are not suggestions, but the set of minimum requirements to be met by the residency program, its respective faculty, and the residents. And the standards are broken into 5 unique sections. Standards 1 through 3 largely relate to the execution of the program. Standard 4 relates to the individuals known as mentors or directors and what they need to do. And Standard 5 largely relates to the residents' roles and responsibilities. Keep in mind that complying with these standards not only ensures an effective learning environment for the residents, but when the residents successfully finish their training, they're competent and able to meet the needs of the patients that are part of the public that educational accreditors serve. Now, within residency, keep in mind, the goal of residency is to achieve competency. And there's nuance to that. Some folks think either you're competent or you're not, but competent is by no means the top rung of the ladder. In all honesty, mastery is actually a level beyond what's even illustrated in the ladder on the right-hand side. So keep in mind that your resident, they're working to the level of competent at the end of the day. And if you think about competent, what does it truly mean? Competent is defined as having sufficient knowledge, judgment, and skill to provide appropriate treatment interventions. At the end of a prosthetic residency, the resident should be comfortable fitting somebody with their second prosthesis, who has a transtibial amputation and a cylindrical shaped limb. And they should be able to go end to end, providing comprehensive patient care from the eval all the way to coding and billing it correctly. Competent doesn't mean that they can fit somebody with a complex Van Ness rotation procedure who also has due to PFFD, who has hip instability. I would argue that level of skill to fit that patient, that is probably pretty darn close to the level of mastery. And that takes many years above and beyond even certification to achieve. Now, something to keep in mind. Earlier on, I mentioned that residency. Well, it could be 12 months, it could be 18 months. Those are minimum amounts of time, but keep in mind, time has very little to do with the actual documentation that ENCO's looking for. We're not looking for a calendar to verify that resident's over. We're looking to verify that the resident is competent. So first of all, submission of a registration form for each residency before the start date is going to be key. Otherwise, the calendar, well, it never even starts. The resident must participate in patient care under supervision and document that care using ENCO Tracker. There also needs to be timely submission of quarterly evaluations and documents by both the resident and their mentor or director. The resident must also demonstrate all required competencies, which we'll talk about in a moment. And both the resident, as well as their director and mentor, must adhere to the ABC code of professional responsibility. Missing out on any of these requirements can potentially delay the residency completion beyond the initial date set. So it does happen where a 12-month residency becomes a 13-month residency or a 15-month residency because individuals didn't do all their requirements in a timely manner. Now let's talk about resident responsibilities. The resident really has some very core responsibilities. First and foremost, register for the residency. Go to encope.org/registration. Form's on our website. That form is going to ask for transcripts. And if you're old school, you can certainly have them sent to our mailing address listed on the contact page, but we prefer electronic transcripts whenever possible. And I can tell you, the accredited programs within the United States all use electronic transcripts. They just need an email address. And that address is info@encope.org. Don't worry, that address is also on the form. And if you need anything else, you're going to need to know the residency site ID. It's a series of numbers. It ends with the letter O. You need to know your residency director's name and their email address too. Those should be pretty easy because in all honesty, that information is right on the residency program directory page. You can just look it right up on the website. Keep in mind though, the core of a residency is a resident must participate in comprehensive patient care. And as a resident, you should be engaged in the level appropriate for your skill. So if you just graduated with your MSPO degree, 1, congrats. And 2, you're probably ready to take an AFO impression on somebody who's fairly straightforward and has reasonably neutral alignment in a partial weight bearing position. But you might not be ready to take an impression for a bilateral hip disarticulation patient fresh out of school. That's going to be something where you're probably going to be observing or assisting to an extent. But keep in mind, the level that you're engaged as a resident should be appropriate. But once you've achieved competency, we're able to actually provide care that's appropriate, you can transition to what's known as indirect supervision, where that mentor director, they can be in a building different than you. That mentor director can go on a hospital call. Well, you stay back and deliver an AFO, for example. Now, as a resident, you're going to need to see multiple populations. You need to see pediatric, adult, and geriatric cases. And I have individuals thinking, well, I want to do my residency at Hartford Children's Hospital. They have a residency site, right? Absolutely. And they also have relationships with other local O&P facilities that enable you to get experience with adult and geriatric cases. The reverse of that is the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs. There aren't very many pediatric opportunities within the VA, but The VAs have affiliations with local children's hospitals and other practices where children are seen to ensure that the resident meets the requirements. And that resident must also be engaged in all phases of patient care, including assessment, formulation of care plan, implementing care, follow-up, and practice management. These terms are probably going to seem familiar if you've actually prepared for the ABC exam, or your O&P faculty members, well, they stuck to the ABC practice analysis or the ENCOs standards. Now let's talk about competencies. I mentioned they're device-based. And on the left-hand side, you have orthotic competencies, and the right-hand side, you have prosthetic competencies. And for every one of those devices listed under the heading of competency, the resident must be able to provide comprehensive care for those devices on a typical situation. And there must be technical competency as well. So for those of you thinking, you know what, central fabs are where it's at, I don't disagree with you. The fact that 87% of all custom orthoses are outsourced, you're right. But you do, as a resident, you'd be able to cut, buff, polish, glue, direct fabrication, and basically do anything a typical clinician might need to do while the patient is waiting in the exam room. So you're going to probably have a patient come in with an old metal AFO who popped a rivet and needs a sidebar recontoured and attached, and the leather work with a couple baseball stitches put in. That's realistic during a residency. You're not going to need to make a all metal HK AFO to finish your residency, but you certainly do need to have appropriate hand skills. You also need to document all patient encounters in ENCOs tracker. And a lot of residents say, well, I already do this in my EMR. Why do I have to type all this stuff? First of all, I don't want you to type much of anything. To be completely honest, all the fields within ENCOs tracker, they're pull-down menus. The only open-ended field is age, and it looks for a whole number. So if you're working with a 3-month-old child, they're 0 years old. Everything else is going to be a pull-down menu or a lookup. So even ICD-10 codes, you could type in the word spastic plus diplegic, and guess what? It'll automatically populate it for you. Now, when I say all encounters, an encounter is a situation where not only you spend time with the patient face-to-face in the room, but it's the time you spend in the back, grinding on that AFO, heating it, pushing it out, smoothing up an edge. The time you spend discussing the follow-up visit with your front office staff and doing additional patient education, the time you spent entering a chart note. At the end of the day, I can think of one good example where I can routinely provide patient care in less than 15 minutes. I'm really good at sock deliveries. When I have somebody pick up 5-ply socks, I could have them sign for it, and I could have it documented in the EMR in less than 15 minutes. And if I was a resident, I wouldn't worry about putting that in ENCOs tracker. Everything else, it should be there. Now, the resident also needs to submit quarterly documentation. So if you're a research track resident, you're going to give us quarterly updates. And there's only a handful of research track residents, but it's important that we know what's going on. Clinical track residents, you're going to have case presentations, professional in-services, journal club moderation, CATs, or a presentation at a state or grand rounds. So you get to mix it up and actually do a variety of these events. But every quarter as a resident, you're going to be submitting an evaluation of the residency program, which you're going to actually provide to the director or mentor. And you're talking about the resources of the program. Do they have the patient populations needed for a proper training to occur? The evaluation of the residency program doesn't evaluate the teaching skills of your mentor. It evaluates the resources of the program. There's a separate form called the evaluation of the residency mentor where you will evaluate the teaching skills of your mentor. And you, the resident, get to decide whether or not you share it. On that note, we have a 1 to 4 scale for evaluating mentor abilities on an overall rating. 3 is almost always exceeds expectations, and 4 is always exceeds expectations. So 3 and 4 are both pretty darn good. The average mentor within an ENCOs accredited residency is a 3.7 overall. And 70% of residents don't want to tell their mentor. If your mentor is doing a great job, consider sharing your evaluation with them. They're candid enough and have to share their evaluations of your performance. And if they truly want to continue to grow as a clinical educator, knowing your perceptions will be helpful to them as well. Now, your mentor and director are also going to have responsibilities, and I'm going to keep this a little bit more condensed for you. Your mentor and director have to ensure the resident's responsibilities and terms are clearly defined. So as a resident, they determine your work hours. ENCOs requires full-time residents work a minimum of 37.5 hours a week, but your boss reserves the right to say you work from 8 to 5 o'clock and you get a 30-minute lunch and 2 15-minute breaks. May even be more than that. They also need to tell you about compensation, benefits, and requirements for completing their residency, because our standards are the minimum bar. Your boss may tell you, you know what? You also got to write an extra paper, or you have to do an extra presentation. They reserve the right to raise the bar. And actually, this is no different than your education at the schools. I can tell you, the CAHEP accredited O&P schools in the US, the vast majority of them go well beyond the minimum CAHEP education standards. The director and mentor must also establish learning objectives. And they also should be maintaining independent records of the program, because ENCOP's job is the registrar. We keep ongoing records, but when you were in school as a student, your professor knew whether you had an A or a B on the last assignment. Your mentor or director should know your overall rating from your previous quarterly eval, for example. And there's other things they'll be keeping tabs on, like ENCOP tracker reports. And your mentor or director has quarterly forms too. Every single quarter, that director or mentor will submit an evaluation of the resident. And most importantly, that director or mentor will be signing off an attestation of competency. They have to show that they've observed the resident actively demonstrating competency for all required interventions. And there's one form that only the director can fill out, the final evaluation of the resident. It's a different form than the quarterly eval even, because it asks different questions, because it's overall, is the resident truly done? Now let's talk about some frequently asked questions and some of the resources that we have here. So a lot of directors and mentors go, what are the critical dates for my residency and when do they need to occur? Well, you could always run what's called a timeline report. Website's right there. You can even create a fake one right now if you want. So anyone can run the timeline report, and it creates timelines for any residency program type or track. Are you doing a 24-month clinical track residency that's combined dual discipline? It can calculate it. 12-month research track prosthetic residency? No problem. It could calculate that too. Just remember, when we talk about a quarter within ENCOP residency, a quarter is 91.25 days. So at a university, a quarter is usually 10 weeks and 1 week for final exams. This isn't academia, folks. 365 divided by 4 is 91.25 days. Also, documentation using ENCOP trackers forms. So residents often go, well, what do I need to know about all these forms? You told me what they are. A couple general things are: one, the resident and the director and mentor should maintain independent copies. Don't worry, you're emailed PDFs and you can download them the second you finish. Forms are also typically due no more than 30 days after the final day of a quarter. So if you submit the form 45 days after that quarter is over, your residency might be extended 15 extra days to offset the delay. So be timely. And also, competency forms must be submitted prior to that resident moving to indirect supervision. So as the resident, you shouldn't be running off to a hospital call on your own to fit a custom AFO unless you've been deemed competent for AFOs. And also make sure you complete the correct forms. So a lot of times I'll have a resident submit a professional activity form when they actually did a clinical track activity. And they're two slightly different things. For a lot of residency directors will fill out the fourth quarter eval of the resident, but they never fill out the final eval form to actually say the program's done and complete successfully. Now let's talk about crossing the finish line. How do I make sure my residency is marked complete as a resident? First of all, make sure there's no missing data in your case entries. So you can actually go to the dashboard and see, have I entered every field? Because in ENCOP Tracker, there's a series of required fields. And also, as the resident or even the mentor can do this, you can run what's called a status report, and you can see every form the ENCOP staff has formally received. You can even see if your registration fees were received by ENCOP, or your transcripts were sent to info@encop.org. And it's the same form that the staff runs. So if you're ever going to email the ENCOP staff and go, hey guys, what documentation do you have on file? All we can do is sign in and run the exact same report you can. But when you call us, we're only available from 8 to 5. You can run this 24 hours a day from ENCOP Tracker. And in terms of pursuing certification, and I recognize that's the end game for the vast majority of residents. I get a lot of folks that say, I'm concerned about getting all documentation in on time so I could sit my ABC exam, because ABC has set dates. What are the most common reasons that this might get delayed? And I could tell you, it's failure to submit official transcripts. Get a lot of residents who will get towards the end of their residency and they'll forget. There's also failure to submit payment for residency registration or the failure to log all clinical encounters. Also, failure to submit all required forms by both the director, mentor, and the resident. I've had the resident do everything right. The director forgot to fill out the final eval until 60 days later, and unfortunately, it delayed their ABC exam eligibility. And last but not least, failure to obtain required exposures. You need pediatric, adult, and geriatric cases. So if you're at the VA hospital and you unfortunately got sick the day you're supposed to go to the children's hospital for experience, make sure you reschedule it and get those pediatric encounters so you can get that residency mark complete. On that note, I'm going to go ahead now and entertain some of the questions that might have popped up during this session. So I'm going to go ahead now and just pause for a moment and see if we have any questions visible within the Q&A tab. Well, that's encouraging. Keep in mind that if you do have questions, the ENCO staff will be manning the ENCO booth via AirMeet during tomorrow as well as Friday. Plus, it's also going to be my pleasure to have you reach out to me using any of the communication techniques we discussed earlier. So thank you. The ENCO Board of Directors, volunteers, and staff are eternally grateful for your support of orthotic and prosthetic education. We hope you enjoy this unique event.